It was 2017 when this happened. I was 28 and living in southern Utah, working seasonal construction jobs and traveling when work dried up. That fall, I had a few weeks off before the next job started, and I decided to get out into the hills, just to be alone for a while. I'd been staying in a cramped rental in Cedar City, and I wanted real silence. No phones, no headlights, no sirens. I loaded my old Ford Ranger with camping gear, a rifle, my dog Knox, and enough food to last me 5 days. I had no plans to hike deep into any national parks or anything like that. I just wanted space and quiet. I picked a spot I'd found years earlier, off a rough dirt road between Blanding and Monticello. Not many people went up there anymore. Last time I'd driven through it, I'd seen a rusted cattle fence stretched along the base of a hill, broken in places, with old posts leaning like they were too tired to stand. There was nothing special about the land. No forest, no river, just dry brush, rock, and wide open sky. But I liked it because it was quiet. You could hear yourself think out there. Knox was a 2-year-old black lab and always eager for a road trip. He sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window as I drove along the rutted road, his nose twitching in the wind. After about an hour and a half of bouncing around and grinding through soft patches of dirt, we reached the spot. It was a flat clearing just past a low ridge and maybe 50 yards from that old cattle fence. I parked the truck under the shade of a scraggly juniper and got to work. I pitched my tent next to the truck, facing east so the morning light would hit it. I set up a folding chair, unloaded the cooler, and laid out Knox's blanket beside mine. No one else was around, not even a distant engine or a plane overhead. Just the wind and the sound of Knox chasing grasshoppers. The first day was uneventful. I made a simple dinner on my propane stove, walked around the area a bit, and watched the sun slip behind the hills. Knox was calm, sniffing and rolling in the dirt. Around 9 p.m., I crawled into the tent and left the flap unzipped so I could watch the stars. I fell asleep to the sound of dry leaves shifting in the breeze. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m., not from a noise, but from a feeling, that weird sort of alertness you get when your brain senses something before your body does. I sat up slowly. The stars were still out. There was no wind, no sound. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. Knox was lying a few feet outside the tent, eyes open, facing the hills. His ears were slightly up, and he wasn't blinking. His body was rigid, like he was holding still on purpose. I whispered his name, but he didn't move. I clicked the light off, waited, then clicked it on again. Still nothing, just him staring. Eventually, I got out of the tent and put a hand on his back. He startled a bit, then looked up at me. His body loosened. I gave him some water, and he drank without hesitation, but he kept looking toward the ridge. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no movement. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a coyote passing through. Still, I loaded the rifle and kept it beside me the rest of the night. I slept light, waking every hour or so to check on things. Nothing changed. The next morning, I found tracks. Not deer tracks, not coyote. These were barefoot human tracks. They weren't fresh, but they were clear. Just beyond the truck, maybe 15 feet from my tent, was a series of footprints in the soft dirt. The heel and toe were visible and the stride was long. Whoever made them wasn't walking. They were running. I counted at least 7 prints heading in a wide arc from the broken section of cattle fence around my site and then disappearing into the rocks beyond the clearing. I looked at Knox, who was sniffing at the ground and seemed alert again. I followed the prints for a bit, but they got lost in the harder, rocky ground and vanished.
No tire marks, no boot prints.
Just bare feet. I didn't like that. Not one bit. I had seen transients out here before, mostly near the highways or small towns, but never this far out. This land was empty. No shelters, no water sources nearby. Why would someone be running barefoot through it? Still, I stayed. I had a rifle, a dog, and plenty of food and water. Maybe someone had gotten lost or was trying to reach the highway on foot. I tried to believe that, but I started carrying the rifle everywhere, even when I went to piss. That evening, as the sun started going down, Knox started acting off again. He kept looking back toward the cattle fence, toward the broken ridge. He wouldn't lie down. He paced. I walked out there, rifle slung over my shoulder. The wind was dry and sharp, and the light was getting orange. I scanned the hills, the ridges, the brush, nothing. But then I found another print, a fresh one. Same as before, barefoot, long stride, but this time it was deeper, like they had been running and stopped short. It was less than 30 feet from where I'd parked the truck. This one was pointed straight at my tent. Knox didn't bark. He never barked during any of this, but he stayed close to my side that night, even when I cooked dinner. After dark, I built a small fire and kept it going longer than usual. I didn't drink, didn't relax. I just sat in the chair with the rifle across my lap, waiting. Knox sat beside me, alert and quiet. Around midnight, he growled. It wasn't loud, just a low rumble in his throat, but it was enough to make my spine tighten. I turned off the lantern and let the fire burn down low. I listened. First, I didn't hear anything, just the breeze. But after a few minutes, I caught a faint rustle to the south, near the broken part of the fence. Then silence. Then something else, a single rock shifting, like someone had stepped wrong. I raised the rifle and scanned the area. The moon was half full, enough to see silhouettes. I stayed like that for nearly an hour, eyes fixed on the dark. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But Knox kept growling very softly, his body low to the ground. Eventually, I went back in the tent, but I didn't sleep. I just waited for morning. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed everything quickly. Knox was agitated the whole time. He kept turning in circles, looking toward the fence. I loaded the truck, but before I could get in, I felt something, a sense like I was being watched. I turned toward the ridge, and that's when I saw him, or it, a person or something like one, standing about 100 yards away, dead still. It was a man, naked, with long limbs and a shaved head. His skin was a dusty brown, almost matching the rock behind him. He stood with his arms at his sides, staring straight at me. No movement, no expression. Knox froze. I raised the rifle, but the figure didn't move. I yelled something, I don't even remember what, and he turned, slowly, and walked back over the ridge out of sight. Not running, just walking like he wasn't in a hurry at all. I didn't go after him. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road near Monticello. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a while, letting Knox drink and just trying to calm down. I told myself maybe he was a squatter, maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe he was high or mentally ill. But the way he moved, the way he stood watching, I don't know. I never reported it. I didn't have a photo, didn't have proof, just tracks and a bad feeling. A few months later, I mentioned it to a guy I worked with on a construction site. He was Navajo from the Four Corners area. When I described what I saw, he went quiet and said I'd camped too close to old land, places where his grandparents never went, not even to gather wood. He didn't say much more than that, just told me not to go back there again. Ever. I didn't. I stuck to campgrounds after that, and I never once left my tent flap open again. I was 34 that summer. My name's Evan, and I was living alone in a small rental just outside Eugene, Oregon. I'd been working a maintenance job at a local lumber mill for a while. Quiet life, nothing fancy. I didn't go out much, didn't have a wife or kids, didn't really have friends beyond a few guys at work. I mostly kept to myself. What I looked forward to the most was heading out into the woods alone, especially on long weekends when I could hike deep into the forest and camp somewhere off the trail where nobody would bother me. This trip happened back in August of 2017. It had been a dry summer, which made the forest a little easier to move through, and I had a new lightweight tent I wanted to try out. I packed up on a Friday, just after work, and planned to hike out to a ridge near Willow Creek, about 3 hours from my place. I'd been out that way once the year before and remembered a long, narrow ridgeline that had a great view of the valley below. The spot wasn't on any marked trail, and I'd only found it after cutting through some thick brush. It was quiet up there, peaceful. I figured it would be perfect. I left early Saturday morning, just after sunrise. I had my pack ready the night before: tent, food, water filter, change of clothes, fire starter, my hunting knife, and a small hatchet. I also packed a 9mm pistol I kept locked up at home. I never liked the idea of running into a bear or a mountain lion unarmed. It wasn't something I expected to use, but better safe than sorry. I drove an hour and a half out to an old logging road that cut deep into the national forest. It had been closed off years ago, but you could still park off the side and walk in. I left my truck behind a thick patch of trees, out of sight from the road, and started hiking just before 8 a.m. The morning was cool, and the air still smelled like pine and dry earth. I followed an old trail for a while, then cut off through the woods, climbing gradually. I had marked the route last time with some discreet rock piles and scratches on trees, and I followed those up the ridge. By noon, I reached the top. The sun was high, and the air had warmed up. I stood at the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valley. It was beautiful. Nothing but green trees and blue sky. I found a small clearing just under the tree line and pitched my tent there. After setting up, I ate lunch, took off my boots, and sat for a while, just listening to the wind rustling through the branches. Around 3 in the afternoon, I decided to explore a bit farther down the ridge. I had plenty of daylight left, and I wasn't tired yet. I left most of my gear behind, just took my knife, a bottle of water, and my phone for GPS in case I got turned around. The ridge sloped downward and curved slightly east, leading into thicker forest. The trees down there were older, taller, with wide trunks and deep shade between them. The ground was dry but soft, covered in pine needles. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something strange. A piece of metal sticking out of the ground, rusted and weathered. It looked like part of an old tool or maybe a hinge. I brushed away the dirt and saw the corner of what looked like a buried door. Flat, square, and made of thick, old wood reinforced with iron bands. I didn't try to open it. It looked like it had been there a long time, maybe an old root cellar or storm shelter from before the forest was reclaimed. The metal had fused with the wood, and everything was covered in moss and vines. I made a mental note of the location and moved on. As I walked deeper, I found more signs of something old. Rotting fence posts, pieces of stone that might have once been part of a foundation. Then, farther ahead, I saw it, a collapsed cabin. The roof had caved in, and trees were growing through what was left of the frame. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I stepped closer, cautious. The wood was black with rot, and the air smelled musty. I could see part of an old stove, a rusted iron bed frame, and a few broken bottles. I stood there for a few minutes, just taking it in. I didn't like the way it made me feel. Something about the place felt off. It wasn't just old, it felt forgotten in a way that made the air around it feel heavier. I turned back toward my camp. When I got back to the tent, the sun was already dipping toward the trees. I gathered some wood and started a small fire just before it got dark. I made dinner, sat in the warmth of the flames, and tried to shake off the feeling I'd gotten down by that old cabin. I kept telling myself it was just history. Old places always feel strange. Nothing weird about it. I turned in around 10 p.m. The forest was quiet. No wind, no animals moving, just stillness. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first I thought it was a dream, but then I realized what had woken me. A sound, a faint crunching, like someone stepping on dry needles. I held my breath, came again, closer this time. One step, then another. I reached for the pistol in my pack, quietly. My heart was hammering. I stayed still and listened. The steps stopped, then silence. I waited, listening, staring at the ceiling of the tent. After a while, I convinced myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. The forest always makes noises at night. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I found boot prints near the edge of my camp. Not deep ones, just a few, but clearly made by a person. The treads were different from mine, wider, deeper, like work boots. They came in from the east, stopped near my fire pit, then turned around. Someone had come close to my tent, watched me, and left. I looked around carefully. No trash, no gear, nothing left behind. I felt a knot form in my gut. I was miles from the nearest road. This place wasn't near any known trail. Whoever it was had gone out of their way to come here. I packed up fast. I didn't want to stay another night. By 9 a.m., I was on my way back down. About half an hour into my descent, I heard something behind me, a distant crack like a branch snapping. I turned and saw nothing. I kept walking, trying not to let my nerves get the better of me. Then, 20 minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. I stopped, crouched behind a tree, and waited. After a few minutes, I saw movement through the trees. Someone walking slowly, maybe 50 yards back. They were wearing dark clothes, a hood, and carrying something long like a walking stick or maybe a rifle. Couldn't tell. They didn't say anything, just moved slowly, quietly, the way a hunter moves when stalking something. I stayed low, moved off the trail, and looped around to the west. I knew the area well enough to take a shortcut back to the logging road. I moved fast but tried not to make noise. My legs were shaking. It took me almost 2 hours to reach the road. My truck was untouched. I climbed in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was back in Eugene. I didn't tell anyone. Not at work. Not my landlord. Not even online. I didn't want anyone to think I was being dramatic. A week later, I drove back out there. Not to camp, just to check something. I parked in the same spot, walked 20 minutes in, and buried a small trail cam about chest high on a tree, pointing toward the ridge. It was motion activated with a 3-week battery. I set it and left. I came back 4 weeks later to collect it. The camera was still there. It had recorded 63 clips. Most were just animals. Deer, a bear, birds, but 5 of them weren't. One showed a man walking past the tree, alone, big frame, hood up, carrying a long object, looked like a shotgun. The last one showed him walking up to the camera. He looked right into it. He didn't touch it, didn't smile, didn't move, just stared. For 17 seconds. Then he turned and walked away. I deleted the clips and destroyed the camera. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will. It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to go out camping on my own. I had been living in southern Iowa at the time, a small town called Bedford. I had just turned 27, working part-time doing maintenance at a local school. I didn't have much money, but I had a decent used truck, a basic 2-man tent, and a sleeping bag that still held up. I'd always been into camping since I was a kid, mostly short solo trips, nothing wild. I liked quiet places, and I always tried to avoid crowded campgrounds. I liked it best when there weren't any other people around. Just me, the trees, and open space. That year, I had been feeling kind of off. Not sick, just mentally worn down. I didn't tell anybody, but I think I was on the edge of burning out. I wasn't married. I didn't have many friends around anymore. Some had moved away, some got into things I didn't want to be a part of. I was spending most of my time alone. So one Friday morning, after another long week of staring at flickering hallway lights and fixing dripping sinks at the school, I packed up my truck and headed out. I didn't have a specific spot in mind, just a general direction. I drove northwest, through smaller roads, avoiding anything with too much traffic. I had a few paper maps and just figured I'd find some public land or a backwoods area where I could be left alone for a night or two. Around noon, I stopped in a small town called Clearfield. I grabbed a couple cans of soup, some crackers, and a jug of water from a gas station. The woman behind the counter looked at me like she wasn't used to seeing out-of-towners, but she didn't say anything. I topped off my gas tank and kept going. It was just past 3 p.m. when I saw the road sign, Graveyard Hill Road. The name caught my eye. It wasn't some highway, it was a thin gravel trail, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, leading off into the trees. Something about it felt right. I pulled over and checked the map, though the road wasn't labeled. I looked around. No houses in sight. No traffic behind me. No cell service either. I figured that was a good sign. I turned onto the gravel and took it slow, bumping along for maybe 2 miles before it started sloping uphill. The trees got thicker, taller, older. Leaves had already started to change, dark reds, pale yellows, even some dead brown. There wasn't much shoulder on the road, but after a bit, I found a flat patch just off the gravel that looked like it had been used as a pull-off before. Beer cans and tire ruts gave it away. It was tucked in behind some thick oak trees, and the woods behind it stretched up higher toward the crest of the hill. I parked and killed the engine. Total silence. It was colder than I expected, even for fall. I could smell the dry leaves and dirt.
No birds.
No wind, just quiet. I set up my tent about 20 yards into the trees, on a level bit of ground under a group of white oaks. There was an old, sunken-in stone wall nearby, like it used to line a trail or mark property. It was crumbling, covered in lichen, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. Beyond that, I saw what looked like headstones. I walked over to get a closer look. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them barely standing, covered in moss, some tilted. A few had fallen over completely. The engravings were so weathered I could hardly read them. I wiped one clean with my jacket sleeve. The date was 1873. Another one just said infant son and nothing else. No flowers, no signs that anyone had been there in years. It looked completely abandoned. I figured this was Graveyard Hill. It didn't bother me. Old cemeteries didn't scare me. I actually liked them. They were peaceful. Nobody coming around causing trouble. I figured I'd have the whole area to myself. After gathering some wood, I built a small fire pit from stones I found scattered in the area and lit a slow-burning fire. I warmed up a can of soup and ate it out of the can. The air got colder fast, and the wind picked up. It got dark quicker than I expected, probably because of how thick the trees were. By 6:30 p.m., I could barely see past the firelight. I stayed up until about 9, just sitting by the fire, staring at the flames. I kept hearing these snapping sounds in the woods. Not animals, something heavier. Every once in a while, I'd hear a footstep on dead leaves. Not a deer's gait, just 1 or 2 steps, then nothing. Then a few more, maybe 5 minutes later, off in a different direction. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a possum, but raccoons don't walk like that, and they're not that quiet. The weird part was how it never got close, just right at the edge of hearing, like it knew how far it could go without being seen. Still, I wasn't scared. Not really. I've camped enough to know that the woods make all kinds of sounds. I tossed more wood on the fire and zipped up my jacket tighter. By 10, the cold got into my bones. I put out the fire carefully, scattering the embers and covering it with dirt, then crawled into my tent. I had my sleeping bag and a fleece blanket inside. I kept a knife under my backpack and a small hatchet near the door flap, just in case. I woke up around 1 a.m. It wasn't a dream. I know that for sure. Something had woken me. A sound. I laid still, not moving, not making a sound. My ears were open wide. I heard it again. A shuffle in the leaves, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the tent. Then silence. Then a slow crunch. One step. Then another. Then nothing. The kind of silence that doesn't feel natural. Like something was waiting. I held my breath for almost a full minute. I didn't move. My hands slowly slid down toward my bag, fingers curling around the handle of the hatchet. I didn't unzip the bag. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I just waited. It was dead silent for a long time. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour. I couldn't see my watch and didn't want to move too much to check. At some point, I must have drifted back off to sleep out of sheer exhaustion. When I woke up again, it was morning. Pale gray light coming through the tent wall. It had to be just after 6 a.m. I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. Cold air. No wind. The trees were still. I walked around the tent. About 10 feet away, I saw something in the dirt.
Footprints.
Not mine. I wear size 11 and these were smaller, narrower. The prints went in a small half circle around the tent and disappeared into the woods. No other signs.
No trash, no markings.
Just those quiet footprints. It rattled me. I kept my hatchet on me while I made a quick breakfast. Just a granola bar and some jerky. I walked back toward the old graveyard and looked around. More boot prints. Not many, just a couple near the headstones. I followed them up a small slope behind the graves, and that's when I saw it. An old wooden shack, almost completely covered in vines and brush. The roof sagged in. The door was half hanging off the hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I stood there staring at it for a long time. The door was open just wide enough to see inside. I didn't go in. I just stood there thinking. There were more boot prints outside the shack. Some looked fresh. The dirt was kicked up. At that point, I knew I didn't want to spend another night there. Something didn't feel right. Maybe it was someone local who didn't want people camping near the cemetery. Maybe it was just a drifter. Either way, I didn't want to meet them. Not alone. I packed up fast. Tent down. Fire pit buried. Everything back in the truck in under 30 minutes. I didn't look back at the shack. I didn't go back to the headstones. I just got in the truck, turned it around, and drove down the gravel road without stopping. But I did one thing before I hit the highway. I pulled over and checked the map again. Graveyard Hill wasn't on it. The road wasn't marked. I looked on 3 different pages and couldn't find it. Just a blank spot of green where the woods were. Nothing else. I tried to look it up later that week, but there was no listing for a cemetery near Clearfield that matched. No mention of a Graveyard Hill in any of the records I found online. And when I drove past the area again a year later, that road sign was gone. Just trees and empty field. I never told anyone the full story. Not until now. I still think about those footprints sometimes. Still think about what might have been in that shack. Still wonder who was walking around my tent in the middle of the night. But I never went back. I never will. And even now, almost 10 years later, I still avoid gravel roads with names that don't show up on maps. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo trip through the southern parts of France. I had just turned 30, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a bit of breathing room from work. I was working a remote tech job back then, and I'd saved up enough paid time off to disappear for a couple of weeks. I didn't want hotels, schedules, or anything that felt like the life I was trying to get away from. I just wanted to go somewhere quiet, somewhere remote, and just be with the trees and the sky for a while. I brought a basic camping setup, nothing too fancy. A single-person tent, a sleeping bag rated for colder nights, a small stove, and a couple of dry food packs. I packed light and planned to camp in a few different forested areas I had mapped out. I figured I'd spend 2 or 3 nights at each place and then move on to the next. The place I ended up staying the longest, 5 nights in total, was near a little village called Rochemont in the Occitanie region. It wasn't even on most maps unless you zoomed in really close. There was one grocery store, one bakery, and maybe 4 or 5 houses that looked like anyone still lived in them. Felt like time had stopped there, and that's exactly what I was looking for. Just outside Rochemont, there was a patch of woods about 2 kilometers in from a dirt road that branched off from the main one. The road was so narrow and uneven that I couldn't drive too far in. I left my rental car in a gravel turnout, pulled on my pack, and hiked the rest of the way in. The forest was dense, with tall pine and beech trees packed in close together. The ground was soft with fallen needles and leaves, and there were signs of old trails, though none looked like they were used often. I liked that. I wanted quiet, and this place gave it to me. I picked a spot near a slight ridge, where the trees opened up a little and let some sunlight in. I could see out over the slope and hear a creek running somewhere nearby. It was peaceful. For the first 2 nights, I barely did anything. I read a paperback novel, took long naps, made coffee over the stove, and walked around a bit just to explore. I saw a few deer, lots of birds, and once I found what looked like an old hunting stand half rotted into the trees. Everything felt still, like the world had forgotten about this part of the country. It was the 3rd night when things shifted. That evening, I had finished dinner and was sitting outside my tent. It was getting dark, and the sky had this deep orange tint behind the trees. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. No cars, no wind, just the occasional rustle of leaves. That kind of silence can be beautiful or unsettling, depending on your mood. I was finishing a can of beans when I thought I saw something move down the slope about 50 or 60 yards out. It was just a flicker at first, a dark shape between the trees. I stopped eating and squinted in that direction, but I couldn't see anything else. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox, nothing unusual. I went back to eating and tried to let it go, but the feeling stuck with me. That sort of crawling tension on the back of your neck that makes you feel watched even when, logically, there's no one around. That night, I couldn't sleep very well. I laid in the tent, listening. Every little sound felt louder, closer. I kept trying to remind myself that I'd camped before, that nature always sounds bigger in the dark. But that didn't really help. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight, wrapped tight in my bag with the zipper pulled all the way up. The next morning, I stepped outside to find a boot print near the edge of my sight. Not a big one, average size, but it was deep. Not made by a hiking boot either. It looked more like an old work boot, the kind with the flat sole and square edge. I crouched down and stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out if I could have made it myself, but I hadn't walked that far out from the tent the night before. The print was facing the tent, straight on, and it wasn't mine. That set something off in me. I felt this slow rise of anxiety, like I'd opened a door in my mind that I couldn't close. I packed up a few things and went for a walk in a wide circle around my site, trying to calm myself down while checking if anyone else had been nearby. I didn't see any other prints, any gear, or signs that someone had set up camp. No wrappers or ash from a fire, just trees and the soft earth. Still, that boot print wasn't something I could explain away. I started thinking maybe someone local had wandered through. A hunter, maybe, or a farmer checking traps. But even that felt off. Why would someone come that close to a tent and not say anything? There weren't any bullet casings or snares or anything like that. Just one boot print, and silence. I stayed a 4th night, mostly because I wanted to believe I was overthinking things. I hated the idea of letting fear drive me off. I was trying to prove to myself that I wasn't being ridiculous. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed in my tent, lying there in complete darkness, listening. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like a branch snap. Not from something falling, but the distinct pop of weight pressing down. Then silence again. Then another crack. Closer this time. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My heart was thudding in my chest so loud I was sure it could be heard outside the tent. I wanted to grab the small hatchet I kept by my bag, but I didn't want to make any noise. Another crack. Closer. Then nothing. I laid there for what felt like hours, frozen. Eventually, the sky started to lighten through the tent walls, and the birds began their morning sounds. I waited until it was fully light before unzipping the flap. There were no new prints, no signs of anyone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. You don't mistake the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in the woods at night. That wasn't a deer. That morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed everything quickly and hiked out to where the car was parked. The gravel turnout was empty, just like before. I got in, drove back toward the main road, and stopped at the bakery in Rochemont to grab some bread and a coffee. I didn't say anything to the woman behind the counter. I just sat there for a few minutes, calming myself down, breathing in the smell of fresh pastries, trying to re-anchor myself. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Like someone had followed me out of the woods and was just out of sight, waiting. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I just wasn't cut out for solo camping anymore. I decided to take a break from the woods for a few days and drove to a cheap guest house in Carcassonne. I figured I'd recharge, sleep in a bed, and maybe check out some ruins. 2 days passed. I didn't camp. I barely went outside. I kept checking over my shoulder without meaning to, but eventually the edge wore off. Then, on the 5th night after I'd left that spot, I got a knock at my guest house door. It was around 10 p.m. Not the front door, my personal room door. I hadn't told anyone where I was staying. I hadn't posted about my trip online. I didn't answer the knock. I just stood behind the door, holding my breath. It didn't come again. I waited 10 minutes, then another 20. I finally opened the door slowly. No one was in the hall, but there, at the base of my door, was a small folded note. Just one sentence, written in rough, blocky letters with a pen that had started to run out of ink. Nice tent. That was it. I left the guest house that same night. I didn't even check out properly. I just got in the car and drove until I was out of the region. I didn't stop until I hit Bordeaux, and even then, I checked into a hotel under a different name using my middle name and paid cash for everything. I stayed in cities the rest of the trip. No more woods, no more hiking. When I got back home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who had been out there? How had they found me again? I went over everything I had done. I had no GPS tracking on, no shared locations, no photos posted anywhere. The only thing I could think of was that they had followed me from the woods, watched me leave, watched where I drove. I still don't know who it was. I never saw their face, never heard their voice. Just one boot print, footsteps in the dark, and a note that told me everything I needed to know. They had seen me, and I never saw them. That trip changed the way I travel. I still hike, but I don't camp alone anymore. I carry a satellite beacon now, and I always tell someone where I'm going. The woods still call to me sometimes, but the silence isn't peaceful anymore. It's a warning, because out there, somewhere in the quiet forests of France, someone was watching, and they were too quiet, too close, and too real to ever forget. It was the spring of 2012, and I was 29. I had just gone through a rough stretch at work, a breakup with a girl I'd been seeing for nearly a year, and my sleep was garbage. I lived alone in a small rental near Fayetteville, Arkansas. I needed something to reset myself. I'd always loved hiking and camping. Quiet, no distractions, just you in the woods. So I packed up for a 3-night trip alone to White Rock Mountain, a place I'd been once before with a friend. It's a beautiful spot. The trails wrap around bluffs, and you get views of the Ozark National Forest that stretch for miles. I chose a remote spot about 4 miles off from the main area. You had to hike down a narrow path that bent along the side of the bluff before it dipped into the tree line again. Not a popular sight, but that's what I wanted, no other people. I left my car in a small gravel lot that held maybe 4 or 5 vehicles. There were only 2 others parked when I arrived late Friday afternoon. I checked my bag twice: tent, tarp, headlamp, stove, freeze-dried food, knife, first aid, extra socks, and a rain jacket. The forecast said rain was possible Saturday night, but I figured it'd be nothing I hadn't handled before. I grew up doing this stuff with my dad in the Ouachita Mountains. The first hike down was smooth. I reached my spot just as the sun was lowering behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the valley below. I set up my tent on a relatively flat patch of earth near a small cluster of rocks. The bluff edge wasn't far, maybe 60 yards or so, but there was enough brush and trees to make it feel safe. I built a fire just to feel more settled and watched the darkness creep over the forest in layers. That first night was calm. Cool air, frogs croaking down in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves from whatever small animals were out there doing their thing. I slept well. Saturday started off cloudy but dry. I hiked out a little further, about 2 miles deeper into the trail, just scouting around with my GPS and marking a few points. Around midday, it drizzled lightly, so I turned back to the tent to avoid getting caught too far out. By the time I got back, the sky was darker, the kind of dim gray that makes it feel like dusk even though it's still afternoon. The rain picked up and didn't really stop after that. I set up my tarp to give me some dry space just outside the tent. I cooked under there, ate a bland dinner, and listened to the steady tapping of rain on nylon and leaves. By 9 p.m., I was zipped into the tent and ready to wait it out. The thing is, when it rains like that, you start to hear things. The forest gets weird. The rain plays tricks on your ears. It blends everything together. Branches creaking, water dripping, wind moving through the trees, and after a while, your brain starts pulling patterns out of it. I've dealt with that before, and usually it doesn't bother me. But that night, it felt different. I lay there in my sleeping bag, dry but restless, listening to the downpour and thinking about home. I must have dozed off at some point because when I came to, I had that strange feeling you get when you're not sure how long you've been asleep. It was still dark, and I could still hear rain, but lighter now. The wind had picked up, too. I checked my watch. It was a little after 2 a.m. I shifted in my bag and sat up to grab my water bottle when I heard something that made me freeze. A crack, not like a twig snapping, but heavier, dull and muffled, but deliberate. It wasn't wind. It came from the direction of the bluff edge, not far off. I waited. The rain tapped on, steady but gentle now. Then another sound, closer this time. A thud, like something pressing down hard on wet earth. I felt my chest tighten. People don't usually come out here in storms. And I hadn't seen a soul since parking my car. Not even on the trail. I tried to calm myself by thinking it was probably just a deer, maybe a bear. But bears in Arkansas weren't aggressive, and they usually avoided tents. Still, I quietly unzipped my bag and slipped out of the tent. The night was cold and wet. I crouched low under the tarp, letting my eyes adjust. My small fire had died down to embers. My headlamp stayed off. I didn't want to shine light unless I needed it. I just listened. There it was again, movement just past the trees toward the bluff. Slow, uneven steps, wet leaves crunching softly. Not animal movement. No rustling, no low padding. It sounded like someone walking, careful but not trying to be silent. I crouched still for maybe 5 straight minutes, ears locked in. Then, just when I started to think maybe it had passed, a figure stepped between 2 trees maybe 40 feet from me. A silhouette. It was tall, man-shaped, and it paused there, just stood for a second. I couldn't see a face, but I saw how it moved. Slow, smooth, not erratic. Stood like it knew I was watching, like it didn't care.
No flashlight.
No sound.
No gear.
Just standing. My skin went ice cold. I slid back into my tent and zipped it slowly, heart hammering in my ears. I had a knife in my bag, nothing fancy, just a fixed blade I used for cutting rope and food packs. I pulled it out and held it close. The footsteps didn't come closer. Not right away. Minutes dragged. Then more movement. Not one direction circling. Not far out either. 30, maybe 25 feet away. Wet ground muffled some of it, but the spacing of the steps gave it away. A slow arc. They were moving around me, watching probably. I sat in the tent for what felt like an hour, knife in one hand, other hand gripping the zipper. Rain picked up again. The wind blew in short gusts, and every now and then I heard them again. Just faint steps, always circling, not leaving. At some point, maybe close to 4 a.m., it stopped. No more footsteps, no movement. I waited longer, 15, 20 minutes. Still nothing. Eventually, I poked my head out. Fog had started rolling in, thick and low to the ground. The woods looked warped in the low light. I couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. I didn't sleep again. I waited in that tent, heart pounding in my neck, until the faintest light started to rise around 6 a.m. The moment I could see the forest clearly enough, I packed. Fast. I didn't eat, didn't break down the tent properly. I stuffed it into my pack and left. Ihiket fast. Took me just under 2 hours to get back to the gravel lot. The rain was back to a drizzle, but when I stepped into that lot, something made my stomach drop. There were only 2 cars, mine and a second one, not the same second car from the day I came in. That one had been a blue Subaru. This one was an old brown truck with Arkansas plates, caked in dried mud, and no stickers or markings. I didn't recognize it. I stood still for a moment, heart pounding again. I checked my car, nothing broken, no signs of tampering. I got in and sat behind the wheel with the doors locked. That truck sat maybe 30 feet across the lot, empty. The windows were tinted dark, too dark for a truck that old. I waited 5 minutes before backing out and hitting the road. I didn't see another person the whole drive back into town. No one passed me. The truck never pulled out behind me. I kept checking my mirrors for the first half hour. Once I got home, I unpacked and laid my stuff out in the garage. My tent was soaked. My knife was still in my bag, but my tarp was missing. I know I packed it. I remember stringing it up with cord I keep on a plastic spool. That cord was still in my bag, cut short clean like with a blade. I never found that tarp. I never found footprints either, though the ground was soft. Rain might have washed them. Maybe I imagined parts of it, but not all of it. That figure was real. Those footsteps were real. The missing tarp was real. For a while, I tried to tell myself it was just a hunter or a lost hiker. But who walks up to someone's tent in the middle of a storm without a light, then circles for over an hour, then leaves without saying anything? Who brings a blade sharp enough to cut cord clean and doesn't even try to steal anything else? Someone was out there, watching me, waiting for something. I don't know what. I haven't camped alone since that night, not even in my own backyard. And now, whenever I pass a wooded trail or drive through a remote road near the mountains, I keep an eye out for that same old brown truck, because if I hadn't woken up that night, or if I'd left the tent open, or made a sound too soon, I don't know how this story would have ended. But I know it wouldn't be with me sitting here writing it. That much I'm sure of. I took a solo camping trip in the fall of 2016 when I was 29. I lived in Colorado at the time, just outside of Fort Collins, and I'd been going through a rough patch. A long relationship had ended earlier that summer, and everything I'd known for the past few years had just kind of crumbled. I was still showing up to work, still taking care of my bills, still pretending I was okay when friends asked how I was doing. But I wasn't. That October, I asked my boss for a few days off and packed up my gear. I had a decent amount of experience hiking and camping, though most of it was in groups or with at least one friend. But I felt like I needed to be alone. I wanted the stillness of the forest, the quiet nights, the crackling of a fire with no phones, no noise, and no one asking if I was okay. I picked a place I hadn't been to before, farther south, somewhere near the San Isabel National Forest. I found a spot on a map that looked remote, with a few primitive trails and a couple of open clearings near a lake that supposedly didn't get much traffic. That's exactly what I was looking for. I loaded up my old Subaru, brought more food and water than I needed, double-checked my tent, my first aid kit, extra batteries, bear spray, even a compact air horn. I wasn't naive. I'd read enough about the risks of backcountry camping. It wasn't bears or mountain lions I was worried about the most. It was people. It was early on a Thursday when I parked at the end of the nearest dirt road and hiked in. I had to go about 5 miles from where I left the car, through some thick pine and aspen forests, across a rocky slope, and finally down into a broad valley where the lake sat. It wasn't big, more like a pond, really, but the scenery was perfect. The air was sharp with the smell of pine, and the leaves were just past their peak, gold and red and flickering in the wind. There wasn't a soul around, no cars at the trailhead, no hikers on the way in, just the faint rustling of wind and the occasional chirp of a bird somewhere in the trees. By early afternoon, I'd set up camp in a small clearing about 100 feet from the water. My tent was tucked under a few spruce trees, and I had a good line of sight to the lake. I boiled some instant coffee, sat on a rock near the shoreline, and just let myself breathe. Felt like the first real breath I'd taken in weeks. That first night was uneventful. I had a small fire going by sundown, ate a pre-packed meal of beans and rice, and watched the sky darken until stars spilled over the horizon. I remember how quiet it was, almost too quiet, but I chalked that up to how far in I was. There were no highways nearby, no distant cabins or RV parks, just miles and miles of open forest and a cold lake that reflected the sky like glass. I slept okay that night. I remember waking up once, sometime after midnight, because of a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just out of place, like something brushing through dry leaves. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart going a little faster than it should have been, and listened, but nothing followed. After a few minutes, I settled back down. Animals moved through the forest all the time. Could have been a fox, a deer, even just a gust of wind pushing through the underbrush. The second day, I spent hiking a few of the nearby ridges. I didn't go too far, maybe 3 or 4 miles out in a loop that circled above the lake. I found an old game trail that followed a ridgeline and gave me a great view of the valley. I didn't see any signs of people. No footprints, no wrappers, no cairns or fire pits. I even checked around the lake again just to be sure. Still nothing. I started to feel more comfortable, more at ease. The first night had left me a little on edge, but the second evening settled in like a thick blanket. It was colder than the first. The wind picked up a bit, and I layered up before cooking dinner. I didn't bother with a fire that night. I just boiled some water on my little backpacking stove, ate quickly, and sat with my legs crossed in front of my tent, watching the stars blink on one by one. Sometime during that second night, I woke up again. It was the same kind of thing, quiet rustling, something brushing against the tent maybe. But this time I heard it a little more clearly. A footstep, not heavy, not crashing, but definitely human. I didn't move. My sleeping bag was zipped up to my chest, and I lay completely still, heart pounding. I was wide awake instantly. I strained my ears in the dark, the nylon of the tent amplifying every sound from outside. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then another crunch, dry pine needles being stepped on. I reached over slowly and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just waited. There was no sound of breathing, no talking, no cough, no sniffle, nothing. Just that one step and then stillness. I stayed that way for what felt like an hour, but it was probably 10 minutes. Eventually, I sat up, unzipped my bag as quietly as I could, and turned on the flashlight. The beam lit up the inside of the tent, casting shadows against the walls. I flicked the light toward the tent door and listened. Nothing. I clicked it off and waited again. Eventually, I convinced myself it could have been a branch falling. Or maybe a raccoon, even though it had sounded like a person. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my camp. I looked for tracks, for broken branches, anything. I didn't find anything conclusive. A few scuffs in the pine needles, maybe, but they could have been mine from the day before. Still, something felt off. I decided to stay one more night, but keep things packed up just in case. I rolled up my sleeping bag and kept it inside the tent with my boots and backpack ready to go. I didn't hike that day. I just stayed near the lake, fished a bit, and kept my ears open. I didn't hear or see anything all day, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. That third night, I kept the flashlight in my hand. I didn't eat. I didn't light a fire. I just sat in the tent once it got dark and listened. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they were closer. I swear it was just outside the tent. Crunch, then a pause, then another. I held my breath. My hands were shaking. Then I heard what sounded like someone kneeling down. The nylon of the tent rustled slightly, like it was being touched or brushed. Not tugged, just touched. I clicked on my flashlight and lunged forward, yanking the zipper of the tent open. I shone the light straight out. There was no one there, but about 6 feet from the entrance, there was a small pile of rocks. 5 of them, stacked in a little uneven tower. I hadn't put that there. I stepped out, shining the beam left and right. The trees were silent, swaying just a bit. No footsteps running off.
No voices.
Just the rocks and the cold night air. I kicked the pile over and walked a few feet into the woods in every direction, sweeping the flashlight back and forth. Still nothing. That was it for me. I packed up everything in about 10 minutes, ripped the stakes out of the ground, rolled the tent up half-assed and jammed it into my pack. I didn't care about neatness. I wanted to be moving. I threw on my jacket, clipped the flashlight to the front of my pack strap, and started hiking out. The hike back in the dark was brutal. The trail was narrow and barely visible, and I had to keep checking my compass to make sure I wasn't getting turned around. Every sound in the woods made my stomach tighten. Every flicker of movement in the shadows looked like a person. I didn't run, but I walked fast. Too fast. I tripped more than once, caught my shin on a rock, and nearly rolled my ankle on a steep downhill patch. But I kept going. After about 2 hours, I made it to the car. I'd never been so happy to see that old Subaru in my life. I threw everything into the back, started the engine, and drove until I hit the highway. I didn't stop until I was almost back in Fort Collins, where I pulled into an empty gas station parking lot just after sunrise and sat in the car with my hands on the steering wheel for a long time. I didn't go back to that part of the state. I didn't even tell many people about what happened. The few friends I mentioned it to said it was probably just a coincidence, some other hiker messing around, or maybe even a prospector or a hunter who lived off-grid. Maybe, But why walk up to someone's tent in the middle of the night? Why stack rocks and leave them 6 feet from the entrance? It's been years now, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. Sometimes when I'm hiking alone, I catch myself listening for footsteps, holding my breath without realizing it. I haven't done another solo trip since. Whoever it was out there, they didn't try to hurt me. They didn't steal anything. They didn't make a sound. But that silence, that quiet presence outside my tent, was worse than anything else. It was the not knowing, the waiting, the thought that someone stood just a few feet away from me in the dark, watching me through the thin nylon wall, not saying a word. I learned something real out there. Nature's quiet, yeah, but sometimes what's hiding in that quiet isn't an animal or a storm. Sometimes it's a person. And people, especially the ones who don't want to be found, are the scariest part of the wilderness. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just turned 34. I worked as a contractor in Grand Junction, Colorado, and after 2 back-to-back jobs ran long and messy, I felt burned out. I hadn't taken a break in nearly a year, and I was mentally fried. So I made the decision to take a week off and go camping in Idaho. I didn't want a campsite or other people nearby. I wanted something remote, quiet, and clean. Just space to think and breathe without anyone asking for anything. A buddy of mine had mentioned the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho a few years ago, and I remembered how he said you could hike a few miles off the trails and find peaceful clearings near lakes that no one else bothered with. I started looking at maps and finally picked a spot about 5 miles north of Redfish Lake, just past a bend in the river. There was no trail to it, just some old Forest Service markers that were decades out of use. It looked perfect. I packed up my older Tacoma with supplies, tent, freeze-dried meals, water filter, first aid, bear spray, and some extra gear I probably didn't need. I brought a small folding camp chair, a thick tarp, and my .38 revolver that I kept locked in a case under the seat. I never used the thing, but the mountains had bears, and it made me feel better having it. I drove out early Sunday morning, stopped in Stanley to fuel up and grab a sandwich, then took the gravel road that curved up around the lake and kept going until it got so narrow I had to crawl the truck through a line of overgrown pine. I parked at the base of an old fire road, locked everything up, double-checked my backpack, and started walking. The hike in was quiet, hot but not brutal. There wasn't much elevation gain, just steady terrain. I didn't see a soul, not a single car on the way up or any hikers in the area. Exactly what I wanted. I used a compass and GPS to guide myself toward the clearing I had marked, moving slow through brush and broken trees. Took me most of the afternoon to get there. The spot was even better than it looked on the satellite images. It was a small patch of grass on a gentle slope overlooking a narrow, clear river. Tall trees wrapped around the back edge, and there were flat stones by the water perfect for cooking or sitting. It didn't look like anyone had camped there in years. I pitched my tent facing the river, set up my little cooking spot, and cleared a perimeter for safety. That first night, I just sat in the chair with my boots off and listened.
No noise, no voices.
Just the breeze and water moving. I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I woke up with the sun and fished a little with a compact rod I'd packed. Caught nothing, but it didn't matter. I boiled water for coffee, sat on the flat stone for an hour, and just let the world slow down. Around noon, I hiked up the ridge behind my tent. It gave a view back toward the lake and the road I'd driven in on, but no signs of life. Not even smoke from other campers. Just endless green. That night, something changed. I was finishing a small fire when I heard a snapping sound out in the trees. It wasn't loud. Just one sharp crack, like someone stepped on a branch. I froze, listened, waited. I figured it was a deer or maybe even a bear, so I put out the fire faster than usual, locked up my food in a dry bag and hung it up, and climbed into my tent. Nothing else happened. No more sounds, no rustling. Still, it took me hours to fall asleep. The next morning, I saw something strange. About 15 yards from my tent, near the tree line, there were boot prints. Deep, solid prints in the soft dirt, about my size, maybe a little bigger. I wear 11s. The tread wasn't one I recognized, and they weren't mine. I had walked the entire site when I arrived, and I was careful about keeping things clean. These prints were new. I stared at them for a long time. No broken branches, no drag marks. Just prints that started out of nowhere, stopped about 10 feet from the clearing, then turned back toward the woods. I followed them for a few yards, but they vanished as the ground hardened under the trees. I didn't panic, but I was uncomfortable. I looked around, scanned the trees for movement, and kept my bear spray close the rest of the morning. I figured maybe some old hunter had wandered through, or someone had followed the old fire road and gotten curious. I didn't like it, but I told myself it wasn't a big deal. That afternoon, I went back up the ridge. I sat there for nearly 3 hours, scanning the woods, watching for any signs of movement. Still nothing. It was dead quiet. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something near the tent. Once it was what sounded like a faint cough. Another time, it was the soft thump of something against the ground. But every time I looked out, I saw nothing. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent and just sat there, listening. I finally stepped out and looked around. That's when I found the string. A piece of thin, orange cord, like paracord, was tied between 2 trees just past the edge of my camp. It had a small loop at the end, like it was meant to trip someone or catch an ankle. It wasn't there the day before. I would have noticed. The way it was tied, it didn't even look like it had a purpose except to get attention. I cut it down immediately. My stomach felt twisted. I didn't want to overreact, but I knew what I was looking at. Someone had been near my camp. Someone had tied this and left it there. It wasn't an accident. That's when I knew I wasn't alone out there. I started packing. Fast. I wanted to be gone before whoever it was came back. But something in me hesitated. I was 5 miles in. If I left now and they were watching, they might follow. I decided to stay one more night but move my camp. I knew a spot about half a mile back toward the road with thicker brush and more cover. I packed everything in silence and didn't leave a trace. I hiked out slowly, circling wide, checking behind me every couple minutes. I didn't hear anything, but I felt eyes on me the whole time. When I found the second spot, I set the tent behind a cluster of fallen trees, deep in the brush. No river, no open fire, just hidden. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my tent with my revolver in hand and the bear spray next to me. Every sound felt sharp. At one point, I heard footsteps in leaves. Slow, crunching, then stopping. I waited nearly 5 minutes before I peeked through a flap in the tent. I couldn't see anyone, but the brush was thick, too thick. I thought about calling out, but that felt stupid. I hadn't seen a phone signal in 2 days, and yelling wasn't going to help. Eventually, the sound went away, and I sat there until daylight. When the sun rose, I packed without eating, without drinking, and I moved fast. I didn't care how far I had to walk. I just needed to get to the truck. My legs were shaking. I kept my gun tucked into my waistband and the bear spray in hand. I took the fastest line back to the fire road and pushed through the brush like a deer on the run. I didn't stop once. Every now and then I'd catch something in the corner of my eye. Movement. Maybe. But when I looked, there was nothing. Finally, around noon, I saw the truck. Just a glint of the roof through the trees. I nearly broke into a sprint. When I got to it, I froze. There was a deep scratch along the side door. A long one, as if someone had dragged a knife across it. And right next to the scratch on the glass was a smudge. A handprint. I unlocked it, threw everything in the back, and got in. I started the engine, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment, breathing hard. I didn't want to think. I didn't want to ask what any of it meant. I just wanted to drive. I made it back to Stanley by the late afternoon. I parked at a small gas station and went inside to wash my face and catch my breath. I didn't tell the guy at the counter anything. What would I even say? I thought about reporting it, telling someone, but what would I report? A footprint? A string in the woods? A smudge on my glass? I knew how it sounded, like I got spooked by nothing, but I knew what I saw. I knew someone had been watching me. They were close, closer than I wanted to believe. I drove home in silence, didn't turn on the radio, didn't stop again except to fuel up. I didn't even sleep when I got back. I just sat in my apartment with the lights on until the next morning. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. I still love the outdoors. I still hike, but I only go to well-trafficked trails with other people nearby. That week taught me something I never forgot. It's not the animals that'll get you out there. It's the people, the ones you never hear, the ones who don't want you to know they're out there watching. And the worst part is you'll never know what they wanted, because if they get their way, you don't come back to tell the story. I did, but only because I left when I did. If I had stayed one more night in that first clearing, I don't think I'd be here to write this. I never used to be the kind of guy who got scared easily. Not of the dark, not of wild animals, not of the sounds that echoed through a forest at night. I was 33 when this happened, and I'd been camping solo for over a decade. I always felt at ease outdoors, away from the noise and mess of city life. But the one time I decided to head deep into Arizona's high desert alone, everything changed. It was 2019, mid-October, the kind of dry, crisp air that makes your skin feel tight, but the sky looks sharper than usual. I took a week off work, packed up my 2003 Tacoma, and headed northwest out of Phoenix, past Prescott, and into the foothills near Chino Valley. I wanted elevation, open sky, cold nights, the kind of place where you could walk for hours and not see another person. I found it off a rough forestry road, about 45 minutes down a rock-strewn path that looked like it hadn't seen a grader in years. No cell service, no signage, not even cattle fences. Just scattered junipers, tall grass, dry washes, and silence. The first night went fine. I set up my canvas tent, something I'd invested in that summer, made a small fire, and grilled a couple burgers on the grate I kept in the back of the truck. It got cold fast after sundown, and by 8:30, I was zipped up in my sleeping bag listening to the slight wind roll through the scrub. I heard some coyotes in the distance around midnight, but that's common in Arizona. Their yipping and howling is just background noise out here. The second day, I hiked the surrounding ridges, took some photos of old, crumbling fence posts, animal tracks, even spotted some mule deer further off in a dry wash. Nothing unusual, just beautiful emptiness. I made another small fire that night, no bigger than necessary. When you camp alone, especially out in dry country, you stay cautious. Sparks can travel fast. Before I turned in, I pissed off into the brush and looked up at the stars for a while. It was one of those nights where you could see the curve of the Milky Way stretching across the sky. I felt good, but things got strange the next day. Started small. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a smell. Not overwhelming, just off. It wasn't the usual dry earth, juniper dust scent that you come to expect out here. It was faintly metallic, a little sour, almost like wet dog fur left in the sun too long, mixed with iron. I checked around my camp, looked for scat, maybe a dead animal nearby. Nothing. The breeze was light, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. But it stayed for most of the day, just hanging there. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to attract anything. Call it a gut feeling. I cooked with my propane stove behind the tailgate and sat in the truck bed as the sun dropped behind the hills. By now, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt loaded, like something was holding its breath. The noises started around midnight, not close, maybe a couple 100 yards off. Heavy steps, not in rhythm like a deer or elk, not skittering like javelina or bobcat. These steps sounded awkward, almost like a man trying to walk on all fours but not built for it. I stayed perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. Then silence again, then a single thump, like something large had dropped out of a tree. Then more silence. I didn't sleep. By morning, I convinced myself it was probably a bear. Black bears still roam some parts of the state, though they're shy and rarely aggressive. I grabbed my .357 from the glove box and strapped it to my hip before I even started coffee. I hiked in a wide circle around camp, looking for tracks or droppings. I found neither, just some broken branches in a small juniper stand east of camp, like something big had forced its way through. But the ground was dry and didn't hold prints well. I shook it off. That afternoon, I sat under the tarp I'd strung between two poles to get shade. I kept hearing a clicking noise, very faint, inconsistent, sometimes just a single click, sometimes two, like two small rocks tapping together. I got up and walked in slow spirals outward from camp, trying to locate it. But every time I thought I had a direction, it stopped. And when I gave up and returned, I'd hear it again. Click, pause, click, 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 like something playing with stones. That sour smell had returned too, slightly stronger now. That evening, I made no fire again, ate quickly and got in the tent early. I left the pistol unholstered and kept my boots on, just in case. I zipped the tent door tight, even though I normally left it cracked for airflow. It was colder that night, down into the 30s, but I wasn't gonna risk it. The wind picked up around 2 a.m., and I heard something that chilled me worse than the air ever could. It sounded like someone trying to copy coyote howls, but not doing it right. Too slow, too long, like someone had heard a pack before but didn't really understand how it worked. The voice was wrong, too deep. There was no rhythm, just one stretched out sound followed by another, like a drunk man playing a broken recording of a coyote on a bad speaker. Then, footsteps, again, only this time they circled the tent. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, hand on the pistol, eyes wide open, listening to the dirt crunch and shift as it moved. It walked halfway around, then paused. I didn't hear anything for a full minute. Then I heard a light dragging sound across the tent fabric, like fingertips or claws. I didn't sleep at all. When the first light showed on the horizon, I waited until it was bright enough to see clearly. Then I burst out of the tent, weapon drawn, expecting to face down a bear or worse. But there was nothing, just the open hills, rocks, brush, and silence. Except there were tracks, but not normal ones, not boots, not hooves, not paws. They looked like elongated human feet, but with the toes spread out unnaturally wide. Some were smeared, like whatever it was didn't always walk upright. Some prints showed knees or knuckles dragging in the dust. I followed them about 30 feet before they vanished on a patch of hard rock. The smell was thick now, like something rotten and unwashed, a musky, oily stench that got caught in the back of my throat. That was when I decided to leave. I packed everything in a hurry, not even rolling my gear up properly. I threw it all into the truck bed, slammed the tailgate shut, and peeled out onto the rocky road. I didn't stop, not even to check the map. I just drove until I hit pavement and kept going. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't want to. That should have been the end of it. But about a week later, when I was back home in Tucson, something happened. I was going through my SD card, cleaning up the photos I'd taken out there. Mostly wide shots of the horizon, dry washes, deer tracks, that kind of thing. I clicked through about 60 of them before stopping on one that I didn't remember taking. It was a photo of my camp, my truck in the background, the tarp strung up, my chair, my stove. But in the left side of the frame, partially behind a bush, there was a figure. It looked human, but not quite. It was crouched low, almost squatting, with arms longer than they should have been. The skin was grayish, not clothing skin. No hair,
No gear. No shoes.
just long limbs and a bent, contorted shape. The head was tilted too far to the side, almost upside down, like it was trying to listen or look closer. I stared at that photo for what felt like an hour. I checked the metadata. It was taken on the afternoon of the second day, when I'd gone to hike that ridge. That meant whatever it was had been near my camp while I was gone. I deleted the photo. I never showed it to anyone. I don't go camping alone anymore. I haven't even left the state since then. Sometimes I still smell it though. That same sour, metallic stink. I'll be walking through a parking lot or sitting in my backyard, and for just a moment, it hits me, faint, almost like it's remembering me too. I don't care if people believe in skinwalkers or not. I didn't. Not really. I thought those were old stories, just Navajo legends or myths told to scare kids. But after that trip, I don't care what they call it. Skinwalker, shapeshifter, predator, whatever it was real. It was watching me, and it wanted me to know. I got out before it decided to do more than just watch. And I won't make that mistake again. My name's David Riley. I'm 42 now, but this happened back in the summer of 2013, when I was 30. At the time, I was living in Pennsylvania near Scranton. I worked in construction and usually had my weekends free unless a job was behind schedule. That summer, the company had a few big projects going on, but I managed to get 3 days off in a row, Friday through Sunday. I didn't want to waste them sitting around. I needed to get out, breathe, reset. So I packed up my old hiking bag and decided to drive north toward Tyogga State Forest. I'd only been there once before with a friend, and I remembered the woods being quiet and the trails mostly empty if you veered off the popular ones. My plan was to hike out on a lesser-used trail, set up camp near one of the backcountry clearings, and just spend 2 nights alone, no phone, no traffic, no other voices. It was mid-July. Hot during the day, cool at night. The forecast showed nothing but sun for the whole weekend, and I felt good. I left early Friday morning, got to the trailhead before lunch, and started hiking in. I brought plenty of food and water, my usual gear, and some bear spray just in case. I wasn't expecting anything dangerous. I'd camped alone plenty of times before and had a healthy respect for the woods. The trail I picked was a narrow one, not even marked on most maps, just an old hunting path that cut away from the main trails. I followed it for about 3.5 hours, deeper into the forest. I passed one old fire ring that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and after a bit more walking, I found a decent spot near a dry creek bed. The ground was soft but level, and there was enough open space to see around in every direction.
No weird feelings.
Nothing that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I set up camp. I had a small one-man tent, cooked up a simple meal on my camping stove, and sat back in my folding chair as the sun started going down. It was peaceful, dead quiet except for a few birds and the occasional rustle in the brush from rabbits or whatever else was out there. I wasn't nervous. I didn't feel watched. It was the kind of silence that makes you remember how loud life is the rest of the time. I fell asleep fast that night. No issues. No animals sniffing around. No sounds of branches breaking. It was around 4 a.m. when I woke up the first time. Not to a sound, but to a feeling. A tension in my body. I remember lying there with my eyes open, staring at the roof of the tent, not really sure why I was awake. I figured maybe it was just that my back hurt or that I had to pee. I waited a bit, listening. Still nothing. The woods were dead quiet. Eventually, I unzipped the tent, stepped out, and did my business about 30 feet away, behind a big tree. I scanned around with my flashlight but didn't see anything odd. When I got back in, I left the flap halfway open for ventilation. That's when I caught a whiff of something. Not strong, not like a skunk or trash, just a faint odor, like wet dog mixed with something metallic. I told myself it was probably just the wind kicking something up. I fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke up around 7:30. I made some instant coffee and oatmeal and sat out by the edge of the tree line where the forest started to thicken. I noticed what looked like an old boot print near the dry creek. That was strange, but I figured it could have been mine from the night before, even if it was in a weird spot. I didn't think much of it. I spent the day hiking around in circles with my compass, marking trees with orange tape so I wouldn't get turned around. Nothing weird happened. I heard some deer off in the distance and found a shaded area where I took a nap on a flat rock for maybe 20 minutes. When I got back to camp around 3 p.m., everything was just how I left it. No disturbance. That night, though, things shifted. It was after 9 p.m. and dark. I'd eaten and was about to settle into my tent when I heard something. Not close, just out in the distance. It sounded like someone walking, slowly, through the brush, one step at a time. Not like an animal. Too methodical, too heavy. It would stop for a while, then start again, then stop. I stood there in the dark, holding my flashlight, pointing it in the direction of the sound, but I didn't see anything. I wasn't even scared yet, just on alert. I shouted out, not words, just a loud grunt or two, like people do sometimes to scare off bears. I did it a couple more times, then clapped loud. The steps stopped. I stood there waiting. Then I went back into the tent. I kept my flashlight right next to me. Took me a long time to fall asleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Just 1 or 2 footsteps. Closed this time, right near the edge of camp. Not circling, just standing. My mouth got dry and my heartbeat got slow and heavy in my chest. I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing through my nose, eyes wide open. I never heard it walk away. I must have passed out eventually, maybe from exhaustion. But when I woke up, everything was normal. Nothing missing. No prints. The only thing was the air. It smelled faintly like old pennies and wet fur again. Same smell as before, but just a little stronger now. I made up my mind to pack up and head back. I didn't want to spend another night out there. I told myself it could have just been a deer or an old animal wandering. But the idea of sleeping again, not knowing, made my stomach twist. I started packing fast, not eating anything. As I stuffed my sleeping bag, I heard something crunch about 40 feet off. I froze, staring into the trees. I didn't see anything, but the smell hit again. This time it was strong, strong enough to make me gag. The hair on my arms and neck rose. I turned, grabbed my pack, and started moving back the way I came. I didn't take breaks. I pushed through the heat, retracing my marked trees. At one point I realized I had gone slightly off the trail and ended up in a part of the woods I didn't recognize. That shook me. I sat down trying to gather myself, but then I heard it again. Movement behind me, just one step, then another, deliberate, slow, heavy. I got up and walked fast, making my way toward what I hoped was the original trail. I didn't stop for hours. My legs were cramping, my back ached, but I pushed on. By early evening, I made it to a part of the trail I recognized. Felt like relief was in reach. I kept moving. That's when I saw something that made me stop cold. Off the trail, maybe 20 feet into the trees, was a small camp. Not like mine, just a crude lean-to made of sticks and a torn blue tarp. There was a pile of bones next to it. Could have been deer, could have been something else. Hard to tell, but they were stacked. not scattered, deliberately stacked in a neat pyramid. Next to the bones was an old, rusted cooking pot, and something that looked like a jacket, maybe army surplus, laid out on a flat rock like it had just been dried. I didn't go closer. I backed away, got back on the trail, and moved fast. I don't know if whoever made that camp was still around. I don't know if that was who was following me, but the pieces started fitting together, and I knew deep down that someone was out there. Not an animal, not a random hiker, someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who lived out there long enough to blend in. Someone who was watching me. I didn't stop again until I reached the main parking area just before sunset. My car was the only one there. I got in, locked the doors, and sat still for a long time. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, more from the adrenaline wearing off. I didn't report it. I didn't call anyone. I didn't take pictures or GPS coordinates. I just drove home. It was like I didn't want any part of it to follow me back. Like talking about it would make it real again. It's been over a decade now, and I've never camped alone again. Not once. I still hike sometimes, and I'll go out with friends if we're near a populated site. But that trip changed me. The forest stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like a place that hides things. The worst part? A few months later, I saw a story in a local paper. Just a short mention. Some park volunteers found a campsite deep in Tyogga State Forest. Same area, same kind of tarp shelter. They said it looked like someone had been living out there for a long time, years maybe. Nobody was around when they found it. Just a pile of bones. They thought it might have been a pet, but they weren't sure. And they found clothes, some with blood. No ID, no missing persons matched. Nothing to tie it together. And that smell, metal and wet fur. It never left my memory. I think about that stack of bones, that crude shelter, and those footsteps in the night. I try to forget, but I can't, because it wasn't a story. It wasn't a ghost or some monster from a campfire tale. It was real, and I was lucky to get out. I was 31 when it happened. It was late September 2013, the kind of damp, cold month where the sun starts giving up early in the day. I was living just outside Leeds back then, working a dull logistics job I didn't care for. That year had been rough. I'd gone through a breakup in spring. My younger brother had moved to Australia, and my job felt like it was eating away my time. I wasn't depressed, but I was worn out. I just needed a reset. I'd grown up hiking and camping with my dad and older cousins. I wasn't some survival expert, but I knew enough to stay warm, dry, and alive in the woods. So, when that Thursday rolled around and I realized I had a long weekend with nothing planned, I thought a solo camping trip would be the best way to clear my head. Just me, a tent, the trees, and silence. I didn't want to go to any of the usual places. Too many tourists, too many kids screaming at campsites or people blaring music from Bluetooth speakers. I wanted silence. I started scrolling forums and old threads on camping message boards, and eventually came across a guy who'd mentioned a quiet spot in Northumberland. Said it was off the old logging trail past Kielder Water, not part of the maintained sites. He said you'd have to hike 2 hours up a barely there trail into a forested ridge, and once you got there, it was just trees, rain, and peace. That sounded perfect. Friday morning, I packed my gear, a green one-man tent, a thick sleeping bag, a butane stove, dried food, instant coffee, a flashlight, backup batteries, and the usual survival kit. I loaded up my backpack, threw it in the boot of my old VW Golf, and drove the 4 hours north. It was already drizzling by the time I got past Hexham, and by the time I reached the gravel trail off the main road, it was full-on raining. Not heavy, but steady and cold. The kind of rain that works its way into your sleeves and socks slowly and stays there. I parked at the edge of a muddy trailhead. There were no signs, just old tire ruts and fallen branches. I double-checked my pack, put on my rain shell, and started hiking. The trees got thicker quickly. It wasn't a maintained path. It was more like walking where an animal trail used to be. The land sloped upward for most of it, and the rain made everything slick. My boots slid a few times, and once I went down on my knee in the mud. It took me nearly 3 hours to get to the ridge, longer than I expected. When I finally reached the clearing, it was close to 5 p.m. and already going dim. The spot was perfect though, a flat patch between two slopes surrounded by thick evergreens. No wind reached the spot, and it had natural runoff for rain. I could hear a stream somewhere downhill, but not close enough to be annoying. I pitched my tent quickly, got inside, and lit my small stove to boil water. The tent was dry. The inside of my boots wasn't. I peeled off my wet socks and sat in silence as the water hissed and steamed. I didn't have a signal up there. No GPS, no mobile. Just trees and fog. It was peaceful. For the first few hours, anyway. I ate a hot pouch of curry and rice, then unrolled my sleeping bag and climbed in fully clothed. The rain tapped the tent constantly. Not loud, just there. Like someone tapping a finger on canvas over and over. I must have dozed off by 9 p.m. I woke up again, maybe around 1 or 2 a.m. Not sure what did it, but I was wide awake. My neck was sore, and my legs were stiff. The rain hadn't let up. It was heavier now. I could hear the water running off the tent sides and the occasional drip from the branches overhead. My bladder was full, so I unzipped the tent halfway and leaned out to take a leak into the grass. As I did, I froze. There was a noise, not from the rain, not the trees. It was movement, somewhere to my right. Not close, maybe 20 or 30 meters away, up the hill behind a thicket of firs. I held my breath, trying to listen over the rain. It was deliberate. A crack, then 2 slow steps, then silence. I waited, crouched in the doorway of the tent, hoping it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. No quick scurry.
No snapping twigs.
Just 2 careful steps and stillness. I zipped the tent quietly and backed inside. My heart was racing, but I tried to calm myself. Animals moved around at night. That's normal. And besides, no one else would be that far up, and if they were, they wouldn't be sneaking around. I lay back down, eyes wide, listening. For the next hour, there was nothing but rain. Eventually, I dozed off again. The next morning was worse. The rain hadn't stopped. It was a steady gray curtain coming down on everything. The inside of the tent stayed dry, but everything outside was soaked. My socks from the day before were cold and damp no matter how I tried to wring them. I changed into a dry pair, shoved the wet ones in a plastic bag, and brewed instant coffee under the tent's vestibule. While the water boiled, I took a walk around the site. That's when I found it. About 20 feet uphill, near the tree line where I'd heard the noise in the night, I saw footprints. They weren't mine. Too big, longer stride, and they were fresh. Not yesterday's, they hadn't filled with water yet. Someone had walked through there. Not just walked, stood. The prints near one of the trees were in place. Deep, as if someone had stood still for minutes. Watching. I didn't like that. I didn't like it at all. I packed my stove quickly and decided to hike down. I didn't want to spend another night there, but when I started heading back toward the trail I'd come up, I stopped. There was something wrong. The way I'd come up, the trail was blocked. A large branch, freshly broken. It had clearly been dragged across the trail, half wedged between 2 trees. Someone had moved it there. Not a storm. The branch was too fresh, too clean.
No rot, no weathering.
It had been snapped, not fallen. It made no sense. I pulled the branch aside, enough to squeeze through, and started walking fast, ignoring the rain. The trail seemed different now. Same general direction, but something felt off. I kept losing the path. kept circling around thicker brush than I remembered. I checked my compass, tried to orient south, but I couldn't see the sun through the clouds, and everything was wet and gray and confusing. Eventually, I gave up and turned back. I didn't want to get more lost than I already was. Back at camp, I sat under the tree canopy and tried to think. I hadn't seen a single soul since parking. My car was hours away. No signal, just forest. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the branch had just fallen weird. Maybe the footprints were mine after all. I spent the rest of the day in the tent. The rain didn't stop. It got colder. The fog came down thick in the late afternoon and stayed. I couldn't see 10 feet past the trees. Everything felt smaller, tighter. At dusk, I boiled water for another bagged meal and sat eating in silence. My headlamp cast a dull glow against the tent walls. My eyes were tired, but my ears kept picking up little things. Cracks, rustles, tapping. Some of it was rain. Some of it wasn't. That night was worse than the first. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something outside. A snap, a rustle. Once, something brushing against the tent. Just a little scrape like a boot dragging. I didn't move. I held my breath and didn't move for 10 minutes straight. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but I didn't. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly. My stomach dropped. The footprints were back. Same ones as before, only this time closer, circling. Someone had walked right up to my tent in the night, tightly, at least 2 full circles. I could see where the mud had been pressed down by a heavy foot. Then, nothing. The tracks vanished into the fog. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I packed everything in under 15 minutes and started walking. I didn't care if I got wet or slipped. I was done. I headed down the hill, following my compass due south, aiming for the road. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I figured if I just went south, I'd hit the road eventually. But the woods didn't end. I walked for nearly 4 hours. My legs were shaking. My boots were soaked. The fog only got worse. At one point, I slipped and slid down a muddy slope, twisting my wrist when I caught myself. When I stood up, I saw it. Another set of footprints. Ahead of me, fresh. Whoever it was had gone the same way, and not far ahead. They were wide apart, like the person had been running. I didn't follow them. I turned hard left and kept walking. No trail.
No campes.
Just get out. Another 2 hours passed before I saw something man-made. An old wooden fence, half-rotted. Then a cabin. It was abandoned. A collapsed roof, blackened fireplace, vines swallowing the sides. But behind it, I saw a dirt road and tire tracks. I followed the road for an hour, then saw the main gravel logging road I'd driven on 2 days earlier. My car was still parked there, exactly where I'd left it. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there in silence for a long time before I turned the key. I drove straight home that night, soaked, cold, and shivering. I never reported anything. What would I say? That someone walked around my tent in the middle of the night? That they broke a branch and watched from the trees? But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there. A few months later, I found a news article while randomly looking up the area again. In 2008, a hiker went missing in that same forest ridge. Young guy solo trip, never found. Then another one, back in 1997. Police said they likely got lost. Maybe they did, but I think someone's still up there, waiting, watching, and I won't ever go back. I went camping in the spring of 2014. I remember the exact date because it was during the Easter weekend. I had taken a few extra days off from work, just a short break. My name's Kevin. I was 31 at the time, working in a small office near Brighton, doing admin for a building supply company. I didn't have much of a social life back then. My girlfriend and I had just broken up, and I was at that strange age where all your friends are either getting married or completely absorbed in their careers. So I thought I'd go out on my own and clear my head for a few days. I'd always liked the woods. I didn't grow up near any forests, but my dad used to take me hiking in the South Downs when I was younger. I liked the quiet, the slow sounds of nature, and not hearing cars or phones for a bit. So I decided to camp near Ashdown Forest in East Sussex. It's not the most remote place, but it's big enough to find proper solitude if you step far enough away from the walking trails. I planned to stay for 3 nights, maybe 4 if the weather held up. I packed light, just a one-man tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, a gas stove, torch, a knife, and a few other basics. I drove up from Brighton early in the morning, left my car near one of the smaller lay-bys outside the main area, and hiked in. I didn't use any formal campsite. I wanted to wild camp where no one else would be around. It's not exactly legal in all parts of England, but as long as you're respectful and quiet, no one usually bothers you. By early afternoon, I had found a good spot. It was flat, dry, and surrounded by tall pines that blocked the wind. I was about an hour and a half's walk from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen a single person the entire hike in. I pitched my tent, boiled some water for tea, and just sat there with my back against a tree, enjoying the peace. That first day was uneventful. I heard a few deer moving in the underbrush and spotted a fox later in the evening. The stars came out around 9. It was cold, but I had a good sleeping bag. I went to sleep early. The second day started normally. I woke up just after 6, made coffee, and ate an oat bar. Then I walked around the area for a bit. I had a small map, not a GPS, but I wasn't planning to go far. Just wanted to stretch my legs and get a feel for the land. The forest was damp that morning. You could smell the earth and pine, and every now and then I'd hear something moving out of sight. Probably rabbits or maybe a badger. Still no people, no planes overhead either, just wind in the trees. That's what I'd come for. It was around 4 in the afternoon when I saw something strange for the first time. I was gathering firewood about 20 minutes from my camp. I'd found a spot with lots of dry fallen branches and was stacking them in my arms when I noticed something off. I got this weird feeling, like I was being watched. That sounds cliché, but it was true. I froze and looked around. Everything seemed normal at first, just trees, brambles, and the low hum of insects. But then, about 30 or 40 meters away, I saw a man. He wasn't walking. He was just standing behind a tree, only partially visible. At first, I thought maybe it was a hiker or another wild camper, but something about him felt wrong. He was too still, and he wasn't dressed like a camper or a walker.
No backpack, no dog, no jacket.
Just a dark sweatshirt and jeans. His arms hung down loose, and I could only see part of his face. Pale, eyes a bit too wide, just standing there, half behind the trunk. I didn't know what to do. I raised my hand in an awkward wave, but he didn't move, didn't wave back, just kept looking. It made my skin crawl. I turned slowly and walked away, not running, but not wasting time either. I didn't look back until I was almost back at camp. When I finally turned, he was gone. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about that man. Who was he? What was he doing out there? There were no cars around, no camps, no trails even. And why just stand and stare? I told myself he was probably just some odd loner or maybe someone like me, just wanting peace and space. But still, something didn't feel right. The third day is when things started getting worse. I woke up to find one of my tent skylines had been cut. Not frayed, clean cut like with a blade. I hadn't heard anything during the night, no footsteps or rustling, but it unnerved me. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now. I felt it every time I stepped away from the camp, like eyes on my back, low to the ground, waiting. I thought about leaving. I even packed most of my things, but part of me didn't want to let fear chase me off. I'd never had anxiety before, not like that, and I didn't want to feel like a coward. So I stayed one more night. I wish I hadn't. Around 11 that night, I was lying in the tent, trying to sleep, when I heard something. It wasn't a wild animal. It was footsteps, human, crunching leaves, slow and deliberate, not like someone lost or walking through quickly. These steps paused, then moved again, stopped, then started, like someone circling the camp. I held my breath and listened. I didn't want to turn on the torch. I just lay there, still, gripping my small knife inside the sleeping bag. Then came the whisper, not actual words, just the softest exhale of breath, like someone standing just outside the tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the bag, grabbed the torch, and burst out of the tent, shining the light into the trees. Nothing, just cold, foggy air and empty woods. My breath fogged up in the light beam. I turned in circles, scanning every direction, heart pounding so hard I thought I might collapse. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat with my back against a tree, torch in one hand, knife in the other, waiting for the dawn. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed up everything and left. I didn't eat, didn't make tea, didn't even brush my teeth. I just walked as fast as I could back toward the lay-by. The air was still, heavy with that morning fog that hangs low to the ground in forests. Every crack of a twig sent a jolt through my spine. About halfway back, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. In the middle of the path, a narrow, muddy trail was a dead bird. A magpie, not just dead, but laid out neatly, wings spread, neck broken, eyes still open. Someone had placed it there. It wasn't killed by a fox or any animal. It had been arranged. Deliberate. I stepped around it and kept moving. When I got back to my car, I checked the doors. Still locked. I threw my pack in the back and drove off without looking back. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time. People don't really believe that kind of thing unless it's dramatic. Ghosts, murderers, escaped convicts. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. There was a man in those woods and he was watching me. I don't know what he wanted or why he didn't approach. Maybe he was playing some kind of twisted game. Maybe he wanted to scare me. Maybe worse. I've thought about it a lot. I didn't report it to the police. What would I have said? A man watched me from the woods? It's not illegal to be creepy. There was no crime, technically. Just one of those moments in life where something brushes against you that shouldn't be there. Something you can't explain. I haven't been camping since. I still go on walks, stick to the South Downs now, open areas with people around. No more solo wild camping. No more thick woods. I still think about that man sometimes. That blank face behind the tree. The slow footsteps in the dark. The dead magpie laid out like a warning. Some people go into the woods to get away from people. But sometimes the scariest thing out there is not nature. It's people. Especially the ones who don't speak, don't move, just stand and watch you like they already know what's going to happen. And if I'd stayed one more night, I think something would have happened. Something real. Something final. I'm just glad I left when I did. I was 28 years old the summer I camped in a graveyard on the edge of a small town called Fairbridge in Oregon. It wasn't a dare or some drunken stunt. I wasn't trying to prove anything. The truth is, I needed a place to stay for the night, and that graveyard seemed like the safest and quietest spot I could find. I was driving through Oregon as part of a long solo trip. I'd quit my job back in California after 10 years working in a warehouse, packed what I could into my old blue pickup, and just started driving north. No plans. Just the road, the radio, and the occasional cup of gas station coffee. I'd been sleeping in the truck for most of the trip, but after a week, it started wearing me down. My back hurt, my legs cramped up. I needed to stretch out for once. That evening, I pulled into Fairbridge just after 6 p.m. It was one of those small towns that felt like it had been forgotten by time. A few brick buildings, a diner, a post office, and one traffic light that blinked yellow in every direction. I remember the smell too. Pine trees and dry grass, thick in the air, with just a trace of smoke like someone burning wood in the distance. I drove around looking for a place to stay, but there were no motels. Just some houses with wide porches, some with rusted-out cars in the yard, others with little fences and wind chimes. I didn't want to knock on a stranger's door and ask to sleep on their lawn. So I kept driving until I saw a sign that said, Graveyard Hill, ST 1889. It was set up on a ridge on the north edge of town. I followed the gravel road up and parked near the gate. It wasn't a huge cemetery, maybe 50 or 60 headstones, spaced out across a sloping hill with dry weeds and patches of yellow grass. The fence was old iron, with a rusted gate hanging half open.
No lights. No cameras.
No signs saying to keep out. It wasn't spooky. It was just quiet. That's what I wanted. Quiet. A flat place to lay my sleeping bag, far from the noise of the road or anyone else. I walked around the place, checked for signs of recent visitors, but there weren't any. Just faded plastic flowers on a few graves, cracked stones, and old names like Eugene and Martha carved in them. The most recent grave I saw was from 1979. After that, nothing newer, like people just stopped being buried there. I picked a spot on the far side of the hill, near a big tree with a broken bench under it. It was far from the road, and the tree offered a bit of shelter. I rolled out my sleeping bag, sat on the bench for a while, and watched the sun drop behind the hills. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, in a way that made you feel like the world had stopped spinning. The light faded fast, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. I boiled some water on my little camp stove and made instant noodles, ate them slowly, listening to the wind rustle the tall grass.
No birds. No crickets.
Just wind. I finished eating, cleaned up, and lay back in the sleeping bag just as the stars started coming out. It was a clear night, no clouds. The kind of night where you can see every pinprick of light in the sky. I lay there a long time watching them, feeling the ground underneath me. It wasn't uncomfortable. The dirt was dry and warm, and the slope of the hill let me stretch my legs. I thought I'd fall asleep fast, but I didn't. It started with a sound, a sharp crack, like someone stepping on a branch. I sat up, looked around, couldn't see anything at first. It was too dark, and the moon hadn't risen yet. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sound had weight to it, a 2-footed weight. It wasn't the soft patter of paws or hooves. It was a step, and then another, crunch, crunch, slow, deliberate. I held my breath and stayed still, eyes scanning the dark. Then it stopped. The silence was worse than the footsteps. I didn't want to turn on my flashlight right away. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Just wind again. I eased back into my sleeping bag and told myself not to be stupid. I was on edge. Maybe too much coffee. Maybe the unfamiliar place. My body was tired, but my brain wouldn't switch off. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I sat up fast, grabbed my flashlight, and turned it on. The beam swept across the grass, the gravestones, the bench, the tree. Nothing. I stood up, turned in a full circle, checking every corner of the hill. Still nothing. But I knew what I heard. That wasn't an animal. I turned off the light and waited again. A long time passed. I kept telling myself if someone was out there, they would have shown themselves. or come closer, but nothing did. I stayed sitting, legs half in the sleeping bag, arms resting on my knees, watching the darkness. Eventually, my head started nodding. Sleep came in fits, 5 minutes at a time, maybe less. I'd jerk awake, check the dark again, then drift. Sometime past midnight, I woke up for real. The sleeping bag felt tighter. Not just tighter, heavier. I looked down and saw that something had been piled on top of it. Rocks, small, flat rocks, about the size of my palm, maybe 20 of them, stacked all over my legs and chest. I jolted up and the rocks spilled off. They clattered onto the ground. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. My hands shook as I turned it on. Who the hell would do that? I scanned the hill again. Nothing. But I knew someone had been close, right next to me, close enough to stack rocks on my body without waking me. I left the sleeping bag and walked the whole hill searching. Every row of graves, every stone, behind the tree, past the fence, down the slope. Nothing. No sign of movement. No fresh footprints in the dirt. But the ground was too dry to hold prints anyway. Back at my spot, I gathered my stuff quickly. I didn't roll the bag. I just stuffed it into my pack and got ready to leave. But then I noticed something new. Another pile of rocks. On the bench. Same kind, same size. Flat, smooth, and stacked in a little pyramid. 12 of them. I hadn't seen them earlier. I would've. That's when I heard the truck door slam. I froze. My truck was parked by the gate, about 100 yards away, down the slope. I couldn't see it from where I was, but I'd know that sound anywhere. I ran. No flashlight now, just the faint light of the moon as it finally rose over the hills. I ran down the slope, feet slipping on the dry grass. My pack bounced against my back, and I nearly fell twice. When I got to the fence, the gate was closed. It had been open before. I pushed through and saw the truck, right where I left it, but the driver's door was open. I crept forward, listening. No sound. I checked the inside. Nothing looked stolen. My phone was still on the seat. My map, my wallet in the glove box, but the driver's seat was wet. Not soaked, but damp, like someone sat there in wet clothes. I closed the door and locked it, got in on the passenger side and slid over, started the engine, and turned the headlights on. The beams lit up the graveyard fence and the road ahead, and something moved just outside the light. I threw it in reverse, spun the truck around, and sped down the gravel road. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles away, parked outside a gas station, wide-eyed and shaking. I sat there until sunrise. I didn't call the cops. What would I tell them? That someone put rocks on my legs while I was asleep? That someone sat in my truck without taking anything? It didn't make sense. And that's what made it worse. The next day, I drove to the next town over and bought a cheap motel room. I locked the door and slept for 14 hours. A week later, I found an article online about Fairbridge. Back in the 1980s, the town had tried to shut the cemetery down. There were rumors about kids going missing up there. Not murdered, just gone. No evidence, just disappearances. The town quietly stopped using the graveyard after that. Nothing official, just whispers. I never went back, never drove near Fairbridge again. But I still think about that night. Whoever or whatever was up on that hill, they didn't want me there. They didn't hurt me, didn't rob me, but they watched. They got close. Close enough to arrange stones on my body like I was already part of that place. And the worst part? I was asleep when they did it. That thought keeps me up sometimes, even now. Not because I'm scared of graveyards, but because I'll never know how long they stood there, looking down at me while I slept, not knowing a thing. And I don't want to know. Not anymore. I was 34 when I went out alone to camp near an old disused quarry in southern Oregon. It was late September 2019, and I'd been feeling overwhelmed by everything: work, bills, family stress. I needed a few days where I didn't have to talk to anyone, just disconnect from the world and feel like a human being again. I'd grown up in Bend, but I'd moved closer to Portland years earlier. Most weekends were spent driving around traffic and breathing in exhaust, and that fall I hit a wall. I packed up my gear: tent, stove, folding chair, journal, dry food, layers of clothes, and drove out on a Thursday morning. The plan was to camp 3 nights near an old rock quarry I'd found on an old forestry map. It hadn't been used since the 70s, and it was at the end of a rough trail, far from where most people camped. The place was about a 5-hour drive from my apartment. The last hour was the worst. Gravel roads with deep ruts, fallen branches, and no signage at all. I had to rely on the GPS and memory. I parked the car behind a thicket of young pines and walked about a mile to the quarry itself. It looked just like the old photos. A wide open pit with steep rock walls, one side filled with stagnant rainwater that had turned a murky green. There were tire tracks from years ago still visible in the packed dirt. No fresh ones. It was dead quiet, with only the faint rustling of dry leaves in the wind. I liked it right away. I set up my tent at the edge of the quarry under some trees, far enough from the drop, but close enough that I could see the rock walls from my sleeping bag. I made some food, scribbled in my journal, and drank cheap whiskey from a metal flask. It got dark fast out there. The moon wasn't out, and once the sun dipped behind the ridge, the whole quarry turned black. I turned off my headlamp and just sat there in the dark for a while, listening. Crickets, wind, that was it. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sharp snapping noise. Something big had stepped on a branch, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I laid still and listened. There was more movement, slow, heavy footsteps. Not like a deer or raccoon, something bipedal. I grabbed the hunting knife I kept in the side pouch of my pack and waited. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. The sound kept going for another 10 seconds, then stopped. No more noise, just wind. Eventually, I fell back asleep with the knife in my hand. By morning, I figured it had just been a bear or maybe even my imagination. I made breakfast, wandered around the edges of the quarry, and found an old piece of rusted machinery halfway buried in the dirt. Looked like part of a conveyor belt or engine, but I couldn't tell. I felt fine all day, peace even. I wrote in my journal for hours and took a nap under the sun. That night was colder. The wind picked up and howled over the edge of the quarry. I built a fire and huddled closer to it than I usually would. I kept glancing toward the trees where I'd heard the footsteps the night before. Nothing looked off, but I couldn't relax. Something felt different, like the air had weight to it. When I turned in for the night, I put the knife beside my sleeping bag again. My body was tired, but my mind wasn't. I laid there awake for an hour, then 2. The trees creaked and moaned in the wind. At some point, I heard movement again, same as the night before, crunching steps maybe 10 feet away. I bolted upright, heart hammering. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but all I saw were tree trunks and brush. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't. A patch of leaves that had been there earlier was now flattened, as if someone had stepped or knelt there. But I didn't see anyone. No sound. Just that spot, clearly disturbed, maybe 15 feet away. I swept the light back and forth, trying to make sense of it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I packed up and moved my camp a few hundred feet deeper into the woods, closer to the slope that overlooked the quarry but with thicker cover. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just needed to reset. I spent the day chopping dead branches and building a better fire pit. I made a small perimeter of stones around my tent, not for protection, just so I'd hear if anything moved past them. I also noticed something strange. About 50 feet from where I'd slept the previous night, there was a pile of small rocks stacked neatly in a pyramid shape, maybe 2 feet high. I hadn't seen it before. It was too precise to be natural. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I stayed in the tent and read by headlamp until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I drifted off sometime before midnight. What woke me wasn't noise. It was light, a soft glow on the side of the tent. At first, I thought the moon had finally come out, but the light wasn't steady. It flickered. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Down in the quarry, at the bottom near the edge of the green pool, there was a fire burning. A small one, controlled but clearly lit by someone. I saw a shape standing near it. Not moving, just standing. The figure looked male, average height, arms at his side. I turned off my headlamp immediately and ducked down. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth. I hadn't heard a car. I hadn't seen another human being in 2 full days. There was no reason for someone else to be down there, this far from everything. I waited for half an hour before I peeked again. The fire was still going. The figure was gone. I packed my gear in the dark. Tent, food, pack, everything. Took me an hour. I hiked back to my car without turning on my light, just feeling the trail under my boots. I reached the car by 4 a.m., and even though I was exhausted, I drove until sunrise. No music, just the sound of gravel under the tires. When I finally stopped at a gas station near Grants Pass, I looked at myself in the mirror inside the restroom. I looked like I'd aged 5 years in 3 days. Sunburned, eyes bloodshot, lips cracked. I took a deep breath, splashed cold water on my face, and told myself it was over. But when I got home and unpacked, I found something I didn't put in my bag. A rock, smooth, gray, and about the size of a golf ball, wrapped in a strip of old cloth, tied tight with twine. I didn't touch it at first. I used my pocket knife to unwrap the cloth. The rock had a deep scratch across one side, almost like it had been carved deliberately. I threw it out. I never went back to that part of Oregon. I stopped camping alone altogether. I kept telling myself it could have been a hiker, maybe even some kind of prospector or drifter, but that doesn't explain the fire, or the figure that just stood and watched, or the rock, carefully wrapped and slipped into my pack without me knowing. I told myself I was being dramatic, but I changed the locks on my apartment door the next week. Started sleeping with a baseball bat by the bed. I've tried to forget it, but sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel like I'm back there, in the trees, in the dark, watching something I can't see watching me. I was 34 when it happened, back in late September of 2011. I lived in southern Idaho at the time, working as a diesel mechanic in a quiet little town called Mountain Home. I didn't have much going on back then.
No girlfriend, no real ablegaschens.
I just went to work, did my job, came home, and stared at the wall until it was time to sleep. Every now and then, I'd do something to break up the routine. Sometimes it was fishing. Other times, I'd go out into the desert and just walk, letting the silence flatten everything out inside my head. But that September, I wanted trees. Something about the end of summer made me crave being somewhere green and wet. I didn't want to go to the coast. Too many people. I wanted somewhere dense, empty, maybe a little forgotten. I had this old camping book from the 90s with all these backcountry spots nobody talks about anymore. One of them stuck out. A place just outside Oak Ridge, Oregon, near the Willamette National Forest. The book said there used to be an old railroad line that ran through the trees nearby, but the tracks had been pulled decades earlier. All that was left was a flat, cleared path that followed a winding river for miles. The book said you could hike in a few miles, then find all sorts of flat spots to pitch a tent. The map even showed an old service road that paralleled the path for a bit, though it warned the road hadn't been maintained since the early 80s. That sounded perfect. I packed my old blue backpack with my tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, a couple mountain house meals, and a bottle of bourbon I'd been saving. I took the Friday off work, got up before sunrise, and hit the road in my Tacoma. Took me around 10 hours to get there. The last stretch was slow, winding up into the mountains past thick walls of fir trees. I stopped at a gas station near West Fir to fill up and ask for directions, just to double-check I was heading the right way. The old guy behind the counter looked like he'd been rooted there for the last 50 years, but he just nodded and said the area I was heading into hadn't seen many visitors in years. Forest swallowed most of the old road, he said. But if you find it, you'll be alone. That's what I wanted. I drove another 45 minutes past Oak Ridge, following a thin blacktop road that curved around the river. Eventually, I hit a locked Forest Service gate, which I was expecting. I parked off to the side and strapped on my pack. I had planned to hike in 5 miles and camp near where the river and the old railroad path met again, a kind of bend the map showed. It was isolated enough to be peaceful, but close enough to the old path that I wouldn't get totally turned around. The hike in was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I've camped in a lot of places over the years, and I'm used to silence. But this felt like the air had been turned off.
No birds.
No wind. Even the river felt muffled. I kept telling myself it was just my ears adjusting, or that maybe the local wildlife was less active in the fall. But still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every so often. Not because I heard something, because I didn't. It took me a little over 2 hours to reach the spot I'd picked. It was gorgeous. Thick ferns covering the ground, massive trees with mossy trunks, and that slow-moving river curving around like a big mirror. I found a flat area with soft ground and a clear view of the water. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going with a portable pit I'd brought, then boiled some water for dinner. By the time the sun dropped behind the trees, I had everything set up. My gear was squared away, the fire was crackling, and I'd already had 2 sips of the bourbon. I leaned back against a fallen log, wrapped in a flannel shirt, and just listened. Still no birds, still no wind, just the river. I slept okay that first night. I woke up twice. Once because I thought I heard something stepping in the brush nearby, and once because I swore I heard a metallic clang, like a piece of steel hitting something hollow. But when I sat up and unzipped the tent, there was nothing, just black woods and silence. I chalked it up to the sound of trees creaking or maybe something falling down the slope into the river. The next day, I decided to explore a little. I walked along the edge of the river and found what was left of the railroad path. It was still visible, a flat, overgrown strip of land that cut straight through the trees like someone had drawn a line in the forest. You could tell it hadn't been used in decades. Grass and saplings had overtaken it, and the gravel was scattered. But every now and then, I'd find an old railroad tie, half buried and cracked. I followed the path for maybe a mile before I found something strange. It was an old wooden post with a rusted metal plate nailed to it. There were no markings on the plate, just a big dent in the center like someone had hit it hard with something. Around the post, the ground was churned up, not like animals digging, more like someone had been pacing in circles. There were these faint trails of pressed-down ferns and broken sticks radiating out in different directions. It gave me a weird feeling in my stomach. Not quite fear, more like being watched in a store you don't belong in. I didn't stick around long. I headed back to camp and tried to shake it off. That night is when things started getting worse. I fell asleep sometime after 10, wrapped up in my bag with the fire burned down to glowing coals. Sometime after midnight, I woke up in a sweat. I had that feeling like I was being stared at, like I had when I found the post earlier. I sat up, trying to hear if something was outside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe, just listened. That's when I heard it. A dragging sound. like something heavy being pulled across gravel. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. I froze in place, staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The sound kept going, then stopped, then started again. Closer. I reached for the knife I kept under my sleeping pad and waited. Nothing happened. I stayed like that for over an hour. Eventually, I passed out again, still gripping the handle. When I woke up the next morning, everything looked normal. No tracks, no damage to my gear, nothing missing. Just that same silence and the same empty forest. But I knew what I'd heard. That day, I debated packing up and heading out early, but something in me didn't want to give up just yet. I told myself maybe it was a tree branch falling or some kind of animal messing around near the old rail path. I tried to distract myself by going further down the river, collecting wood and skipping rocks, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I turned around, I expected to see something or someone. At dusk, I lit the fire early and made dinner. I kept checking the trees around camp, shining my flashlight into the brush even though I knew that wasn't smart. You don't want to show fear out there. Predators, human or animal, can sense it. That night, I barely slept. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't dragging. It was footsteps, not fast, not running, but steady, crunching lightly over the forest floor. One step every couple seconds, coming from the old rail path. I didn't move. I listened as they got closer, then stopped, then closer again, then silence. I stayed frozen, the knife pressed to my chest under the sleeping bag. I must have stayed like that for 2 hours before the birds finally started singing again. That was the first time I'd heard them since I got there. In the morning, I unzipped the tent and looked around. Still no tracks, still no broken branches. But the fire pit I dug out had been filled back in, like someone had come through in the night and scooped all the cold ash and rocks back into the hole. That was it. I packed up in 15 minutes and got the hell out of there. I didn't eat. I didn't drink water. I just walked, fast and quiet, back the way I came. On the way back, I passed the wooden post again. This time, there was something sitting at the base. A shoe, just one. Old, muddy, ripped open along the side. I didn't stop to look closer. I reached the truck just before noon. I tossed everything in the back and drove until I hit the highway. I didn't stop until I reached Bend. I never went back. I didn't tell anyone the full story either. I made up some excuse about rain and gear trouble when my coworkers asked why I came back early. But the truth is, I don't know what I heard or who might have been out there. All I know is that place wasn't abandoned. Not really. Someone was still walking that path. Someone who didn't want to be found. And maybe someone who didn't want me to leave. But I did. And I never set foot near Oak Ridge again.